Hi, I'm Corinne, and this is the story of how my family stole my name and forged it into their own legacy. The last time I saw my mother, she told me I'd never matter. Weeks later, I heard my name again, not in love, not in memory, but in a courtroom, stamped on a will I never signed. They erased me, neatly, legally, but not quietly, because what they forgot was that Grandpa left the truth in someone else's drawer, and I was the one holding the key. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt like your silence was more convenient for them than your presence? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This isn't just a story about inheritance. It's about voice, value, and the kind of strength they didn't see coming. They didn't hesitate. My name was printed on the page, but the ink wasn't mine, and neither was the signature. The courthouse smelled like varnished benches, old paper, and burnt coffee left too long on a hot plate. I stood at the back, just inside the door, wondering how many people in this room had heard my name and already decided who I was. President's Day had come and gone, but the cold still held on like it had something left to prove. My coat did little to stop the wind sneaking through cracks in the courthouse windows. I hadn't been invited to the hearing, only found out through a misfired email that somehow slipped past their filters. I wasn't supposed to be here, but here I was. When the clerk read out the will, I listened in silence. No expectation, no hope. I'd been written out of enough things to know better. But then, there it was. My name. Not as heir, as a witness. I didn't even need to look at the document to know it was a lie. But I stepped forward when the judge called me anyway. "Miss Aldridge," he said, sliding the paper toward me. "Is this your signature?" I looked down. Neat cursive, too careful. My name. But the middle initial was wrong. The way the G curved, it wasn't mine. It didn't belong to the girl who learned cursive on scratch pads at Grandpa's kitchen table. "No, sir," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's not." Silence, thick and curious, rolled through the room. From the front table, my mother turned her head slowly. Delia, still upright, tailored, commanding. "Oh, stop it," she hissed, lips pursed. "Don't do this here." But I stayed where I was. "I didn't sign it." Then she stood, walked toward me in heels that snapped against the floor like punctuation marks. Before I could brace, her palm cracked across my cheek. A gasp rose from the gallery. My skin burned, but what hurt deeper was the confirmation that she didn't think I mattered enough to be silent about it anymore. "You don't get to ruin this," she whispered. And Melora, always poised, leaned in from her seat. "You always ruin everything," she said, smiling with her teeth and not her eyes. The judge banged his gavel. "Recess," he said sharply. I walked out without waiting. The cold hit me harder than her hand had. I kept walking, down the steps and toward the street, breath fogging, cheeks stinging. I shoved my hands into my coat pockets to warm them, but my fingers closed around something unexpected. Metal. I pulled it out slowly. The old silver hair clip Grandpa gave me when I turned 15. The edges dulled with time, but still firm in the clasp. Still mine. Outside in the cold, her hand finds the old silver hair clip in her coat pocket. Her grandfather's gift. Still there. Mr. Thorne didn't call. He just knocked, like someone who still believed in doors and decency. It was already dark when I heard it. The knock. 1, then 2, deliberate raps. I wasn't expecting anyone. The courthouse still buzzed in my head. The slaps still echoed on my skin, and I hadn't turned on more than one light in the apartment since I got home. But something about that knock made me pause. Through the peephole, I saw him. Mr. Thorne. Grandpa's neighbor from 2 houses down. He stood hunched in his coat, one hand on his cane, the other holding something wrapped in foil. When I opened the door, he nodded. "Evening, Corinne," he said in that gravel voice of his. "Didn't want to call. Figured I'd just come by." I stepped aside and let him in. The apartment felt smaller with someone else inside. Its walls too close, its silence too loud. He walked slowly to the chair by the kitchen window and sat like he'd been saving his weight for just that cushion. He placed a tin on the table and then, from his coat, pulled a worn manila envelope. "Your grandfather gave this to me," he said, setting it gently in front of me. "Told me to hold on to it. Said if things ever got messy, I'd know when to pass it along." My hands hesitated before picking it up. The flap was sealed with tape that had started to yellow. I opened it carefully and slid out the letter. Grandpa's handwriting, sharp and slanted, filled the page. "If you're reading this," it began, "they did what I feared, but you know where the real record is." He told me to look under the drawer in the study, the one with the old farm ledgers. He said he filed the updated will with his attorney, but he also left a copy there, just in case. I read the letter 3 times, the words getting heavier each time. "You stayed," the last paragraph read. "That counts." "More than you know." Mr. Thorne didn't speak as I folded the letter. He just watched me the way older folks do, without pressure, but with full attention. I reached into my coat pocket, still holding the hair clip I hadn't let go since court. For the first time in hours, I looked at it closely. On the inside of the silver clasp was something I'd never noticed before. Tiny numbers, etched so faintly, I had to tilt it under the light. 12. He always said that was my lucky year. The year I helped fix the fence and bake the pies. The year I carried more weight than they ever saw. Mr. Thorne stood. "I'll leave you to it," he said, patting his knee as he straightened up. "But if you need anything, knock. I still believe in answering." After he left, I sat for a long time in the quiet. The envelope beside me, the clip in my hand. Then I walked to the filing box I kept under the bookshelf. Inside were receipts, old insurance forms, and a Target return slip from 6 months ago. There, in black ink, was my signature. Corinne J. Aldridge. She opens her filing box and compares a Target receipt signed Corinne J. Aldridge. Not T. The court paper said T. She never uses T. Have you ever felt like I do now? Like the only person who truly saw you isn't here anymore? If you've ever found comfort in someone's quiet faith, even after they were gone, comment number 9 below. Now, let's see what happened next in this story. Gwen always said I was too quiet. That morning, I let silence tell its own story. Bee's Diner hadn't changed. Same cracked vinyl booths, same Cubs hats on the waitresses, same smell of bacon grease and cinnamon that clung to the curtains like perfume. I slipped into a corner booth by the window, pulling my coat tighter. March sun lit the tops of the sugar shakers, but the cold still curled beneath the door. Gwen spotted me before I could wave. She didn't ask if I wanted coffee, just brought it over, piping hot and already laced with cream, just how I used to take it in high school. The mug came resting on a folded napkin, her way of saying she remembered. "I saw the hearing," she said softly, setting it down. "Didn't want to pry. Just figured you might need caffeine and someone who still calls you C." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. From my satchel, I pulled out the manila folder. Court copies, medical dates, Grandpa's letter. Gwen glanced down, then slid into the opposite seat without needing permission. I flipped through until I found the notarized copy they'd used in court. The stamp sat in the bottom corner, smug and official. April 14th. I stared at it, willing myself not to react. Grandpa died March 21st. They didn't just lie, I said quietly, more to myself than Gwen. They made him part of it after he was gone. Gwen's mouth tightened. That slap? She said, voice low. It wasn't just for the will. It was to remind you to stay small. You always were the one they could blame things on and expect silence. I didn't answer. I just reached into my coat and pulled out the hair clip, resting it on the table. Its silver had dulled, but it still caught the light like it had something to say. I turned it slowly between my fingers. I used to think handwriting made things more real, I said, but they didn't even bother to fake mine well. Gwen nodded toward the receipt pile. Let me guess. They didn't know you've never used your middle initial as T? Never once. A lull fell between us. The diner hummed in the background. Forks on plates, the fridge buzzing, someone asking for more syrup at the next table. But in our booth, the air was different. Dense with something new. Proof. I should call, I said finally. My fingers were already moving, dialing before I realized it. She dials the probate clerk's office. Hi, this is Corinne Aldridge. I'd like to access the full record of Samuel Aldridge's estate. Some people bury the truth. Others fold it up and tuck it into a drawer, just in case someone comes asking. Aunt Karis's house sat at the edge of town, like it had been left behind on purpose. The porch sagged in the middle, the lilacs beside it long overgrown and climbing into the gutters. I hadn't been here since I was a teenager, and even then, never alone. I knocked twice. The door creaked open halfway before I heard her voice, low, measured. I figured you might come, she said. She looked smaller than I remembered, but not weaker. Her hair was cropped close, silver at the edges. She wore a housecoat and held a tea towel in one hand, like she wasn't ready to put it down just yet. I stepped inside slowly. The house smelled of cedar and mint tea. Something familiar tugged at me in the quiet. A gospel radio playing faintly in the background, and a set of lace curtains still tied with yellow ribbon. She didn't ask why I came. Instead, she walked straight to a wooden cabinet in the back room, one I barely remembered, and pulled out a ring of old keys. With a shaky hand, she unlocked the middle drawer. It groaned as it opened, revealing a cloth-bound binder, faded at the edges, but intact. This is what he left me, she said, placing it gently on the table between us. Told me to give it only if someone came asking the right question. I opened the binder with care, my breath held tight. Inside, a notarized will, dated months before the one they used in court. Corinne J. Aldridge, sole beneficiary. His signature bold and certain. Tucked inside was a yellow sticky note, still clinging after all this time. She held the line when they dropped it. My throat tightened. You weren't the favorite, Aunt Karis said quietly, but you were the one who showed up. That matters more. I didn't respond right away. I ran my hand down the edge of the page, the paper soft from age, but real. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about reclaiming what had always been quietly mine. She turned and poured a second mug of tea without asking. As I held it, warm and earthy in my palms, I looked again at the binder. I need to make copies, I said. My voice came out steady. It's time they signed something real. She copies the binder into a protective sleeve and says, It's time they signed something real. They used my name without permission. Now I'd give them one last chance to use their own. The air in the old house hadn't changed. It still smelled faintly of lemon polish and dust, the kind that settled into carpet over decades. The same lamp flickered by the hall, and the family portrait above the mantel was still there. My face softened by water damage at the corner, like even the house had tried to forget me. I set the folder on the coffee table. Each paper inside had been placed with care. Certified copies, notarized pages, my grandfather's signature, steady and unmistakable. I didn't sit, I waited. Delia entered first. Her heels clicked across the floor, but she said nothing. Just looked at the table, then at me. No hello. Melora came in 5 minutes later, wine glass already in hand, makeup too perfect for a casual visit. She gave me a once-over like I was an old grocery list she didn't remember writing. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice light, but eyes already calculating. "You know what it is." I opened the folder, turned the pages one by one. The trust, the signature dates. My name, right where it belonged. Not as a witness, but as the inheritor. I let the silence stretch. Melora rolled her eyes. "So what if it's a technicality?" I didn't flinch. "It's not. It's forgery, perjury, and misuse of estate law." Delia remained silent. Her arms crossed. Her mouth is flat line. I placed the withdrawal agreement beside the folder. "You can sign this, acknowledging the trust and stepping back, or I file for full court review, and every document you tampered with becomes public." Melora stared at it, then at me. She picked up the pen, hand trembling. The ink skipped once, then dragged across the page. Delia still hadn't moved. Through the front window, I saw Mrs. Hightower pruning her hydrangeas like she did every early evening. She looked up once, straight through the glass. Delia noticed too. She walked over, picked up the pen, and signed. No words. But when she looked at me, her eyes held something between disbelief and the first edge of truth. I didn't wait. I turned and walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind me. Corinne walks out. No cameras, no applause. Just me, a binder, and a key to the house I once brought my own folding chair to. Spring had finally arrived in Terre Haute. The snow was gone, replaced by muddy patches and soft grass that pressed back when you walked. Birds chirped on the windowsill like they'd always belonged there. And I, for once, didn't feel like I had to knock before entering. I moved in slowly, one room at a time. The living room first, just dusting, rearranging. Then the kitchen, where I threw out 3 expired spice jars and cried over none of them. The study took longer. I repainted the walls a pale blue, the same shade as Grandpa's old truck, and found tucked behind the file cabinet a receipt with my name. It was the hospital bill. I'd paid it with a debit card and a prayer I wouldn't overdraft. I didn't need it for court, but I kept it anyway. One afternoon, I saw Amelia outside again, sitting on the curb with her hoodie pulled tight around her ears. I opened the door and called softly, "You hungry?" She looked up, uncertain, then nodded. I poured us tea and brought out crackers and apple slices. She didn't say much, but her eyes scanned the house like it was too good to trust. I led her to the study and opened the door. "This room's for writing things down," I said. "Stuff no one else wants to hear." She blinked, like the idea needed translation. Then she stepped inside. A few days later, Mrs. Hightower showed up at the porch with a container of lemon bars. "For the quiet one," she said, and didn't need to explain further. She left before I could thank her, but I made a mental note to return the container, clean, with something warm inside. In the weeks that followed, I worked with a volunteer lawyer to draft the frame. Some homes don't echo with voices. They hold them. In every quiet step I took through those familiar halls, I wasn't just walking through memory. I was rewriting who was allowed to matter. We're taught that loud means strong and silence means surrender. But sometimes, the quietest person is the one carrying the most truth. Kindness, like trust, doesn't wear a label, and those we overlook may one day hold the key to everything we forgot. Like light filtering through lace curtains at dusk, the most powerful legacies are the ones built on grace, not noise. If this story reminded you of someone who stayed in the background too long, leave a comment below. Tell us their name, their strength. And if you'd like more stories like this one, subscribe and stay a while. We've got room at the table.